So, a person and their friend get together one night to smoke a bong. Then, after smoking some of the weed, one of the friends gets two knives and stabs the other friend over 100 times, thus resulting in his death. After the person is arrested and tried for the crime, she blames the pot, and in the end she only gets 2 years of felony probation and no jail time. Incredible? Not really, because that is what happened back in 2018 in Ventura County, California. On May 27, 2018, Chad O'Melia, 26 years old, and Bryn Spejcher, 27 years old, were hanging out at Chad's apartment in Thousand Oaks, California. The two had met several weeks earlier at a local dog park. Spejcher would later say that they were dating and that they were intimate. Other sources would say that they had only been seeing each other for about a month. Professionally, O'Melia was working at an accounting firm while Spejcher was employed as an audiologist. Spejcher says that 2 days before the incident, she told O'Melia she was not interested in a romantic relationship. However, she remained close to him because she'd recently moved into the area and she didn't have many friends. Since O'Melia was dead, no one really knew the status of their relationship except for what Spejcher stated to the police. Prior to that night, according to Spejcher, she had only used marijuana a few times. O'Melia was a more frequent user of pot. During that night, they had started to smoke marijuana. Spejcher testified that after the first few hits, she did not feel much of an effect by the pot. She stated that O'Melia urged her or egged her on to take a more intense, potent hit from the bong. She testified that she was reluctant but complied. She then stated that almost immediately after the more intense hit, she experienced a strong physical reaction involving coughing and dizziness, forcing her to lay on the couch. She asked O'Melia to keep an eye on her. She then said she lost touch with reality and began to experience visual hallucinations. According to Spejcher, it was during this psychotic state that she then went into the kitchen and she retrieved 2 large knives. At that point, she found O'Melia and stabbed him repeatedly for a total number of 108 stab wounds. The wounds were sharp force wounds in the abdomen and other vital parts. In her own words, she saw 2 hands grabbing knives and then saw a dog in front of her. Unfortunately, not only was O'Melia dead, but also his dog was stabbed to death during this encounter. Around 12:04 a.m. on the night of the incident, multiple neighbors heard screaming, loud noises, and cries for help coming from the apartment. One neighbor specifically reported hearing a woman's screams followed by silence, which alarmed them enough to call police. As the police arrived, Spejcher was found still holding a knife and was screaming hysterically. There were also indications that she had stabbed herself with some wounds on her neck, but nothing fatal. Upon their arrival, officers attempted to disarm her, which required them to use a taser and a baton to get her to drop the knife. As for O'Melia, he was found lying in a pool of blood. He was pronounced dead at the scene by the paramedics. Initially, Spejcher was charged with murder. However, before trial, the prosecutors downgraded the charges to involuntary manslaughter due to a prosecution medical expert's opinion. At trial, the details regarding O'Melia's death were testified to by the medical examiner Dr. Othan Mina. According to Dr. Mina, O'Melia suffered more than 100 sharp force wounds consisting of dozens of stab wounds and incise wounds. The autopsy found that the wounds came from what appeared to be 2 different knives, one of which was serrated. There were 18 wounds on the head, including 2 stab wounds to the back of the head and other incise wounds on the face. Approximately 27 incise wounds on the neck. Among them, 4 stab wounds to the neck penetrated critical structures, trachea, jugular vein, and carotid artery. On the torso, shoulders, chest, and back, there were around 21 incise wounds and 13 stab wounds. Some wounds penetrated lungs. The heart was perforated twice. Interestingly, there were multiple defensive wounds to the victim's hands as he attempted to block or fend off the attack. Spejcher also had wounds on her own body. There was a stab or slash to her neck and some cuts on face and neck, but nothing life-threatening. Initially, Spejcher was charged with the murder of O'Melia. California Penal Code Section 187 states that murder is the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought, which is an express intent to kill, or implied malice, meaning a conscious disregard for human life or depraved indifference. To convict of murder, the people must prove malice beyond a reasonable doubt. However, before trial, prosecutors reduced the original murder charge to involuntary manslaughter after medical experts, both prosecution and defense experts, concluded that Spejcher had suffered a cannabis-induced psychotic disorder at the time of the killing. Involuntary manslaughter is California Penal Code Section 192B, which states that an unlawful killing without malice, typically from criminal negligence, is an unlawful act not amounting to a felony or where the actor lacked intent. In this case, the prosecution believed that there was little evidence to show malice since she experienced an acute psychotic episode. After sitting for trial, Spejcher was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter in December 2023. During the trial, both the prosecution's and defense's medical experts concluded that Spejcher was suffering from a cannabis-induced psychotic disorder at the time of the killing. The defense argued that she was not even guilty of involuntary manslaughter since she was experiencing a psychotic episode. The question is then, what exactly is a cannabis-induced psychotic disorder? Cannabis-induced psychotic disorder is a specific mental health condition recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This disorder is within the category of schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. A diagnosis of cannabis-induced psychotic disorder is given when one or both of hallucinations and delusions are present. The hallucinations or delusions develop during or soon after cannabis intoxication. The disturbance does not occur exclusively during the course of a delirium, and the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Cannabis-induced psychotic disorder can last for days and even weeks after cannabis exposure, unlike simple cannabis intoxication, which resolves within 24 hours. The disorder involves hallucinations and delusions that are the focus of the clinical presentation and are severe enough to warrant clinical treatment. Unlike cannabis intoxication, the hallucinations in cannabis-induced psychotic disorder are experienced without insight. Interestingly, cannabis-induced psychotic disorder has a significant association with future mental health problems. A Danish medical study reported that 41.2% of patients with cannabis-induced psychotic disorder eventually converted their condition to schizophrenia. A total of 47.4% of patients with cannabis-induced psychotic disorder eventually converted to either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. The study concluded that this makes cannabis-induced psychotic disorder an important diagnostic consideration, as it may represent an early warning sign of more serious psychiatric conditions requiring ongoing monitoring and treatment. The prosecution retained the services of a medical expert to determine the validity of the defense being asserted by the defendant. Dr. Chris Mohanty was a clinical and forensic psychologist and had been retained by law enforcement in the past for other cases. As the retained expert, he examined Spejcher before the trial. In addition, he reviewed Spejcher's interviews with law enforcement and examined the police body camera footage. He conducted tests to determine whether Spejcher was exaggerating or faking her mental symptoms. After reviewing all the material, Mohanty concluded that Spejcher had lost touch with reality due to a cannabis-induced psychotic disorder on the night of the stabbing. He concluded that her behavior was not feigned and that the tests she underwent supported that Spejcher really was experiencing psychosis. Mohanty went so far as to state that Spejcher was unconscious during parts of the killing. This expert's report was one of the key reasons for the prosecution to charge her with involuntary murder. During the trial, 3 medical experts testified about Spejcher's condition. 2 of the experts were retained by the defense and Dr. Mohanty was retained by the prosecution. All of them agreed that she had cannabis-induced psychosis during the stabbing. But what about voluntary intoxication caused by drugs or alcohol as a criminal defense? In California, voluntary intoxication is not a valid criminal defense. California Penal Code Section 29.4 states that voluntary intoxication is not a defense to general intent crimes, like involuntary manslaughter. This defense can sometimes be considered on whether the defendant formed specific intent, also known as premeditation, but it doesn't erase culpability. So if someone gets high and kills someone, they can still be convicted of murder. But this case was different. All 3 experts, including the prosecution's expert Dr. Chris Mohanty, testified Spejcher wasn't just high. She had a cannabis-induced psychotic disorder, a rare reaction where the brain loses contact with reality. Mohanty's report found she was legally unconscious at the time of the stabbing. All the experts agreed that she did not understand the reality of her situation, and she could not intend to kill or appreciate that her acts, slashing and thrusting 2 knives into a person, endangered anyone's life. Interestingly, California does have the unconsciousness defense, as explained in California Jury Instructions 3425. California law recognizes legal unconsciousness as a complete defense to crimes requiring intent or malice. Spejcher's behavior, screaming uncontrollably, stabbing herself in the neck while officers begged her to stop, not responding to commands, could support this defense. One of the fist cases to raise the unconsciousness defense was the 1970 case of People v. Newton, 8 California Appellate Division 3rd, 359. Huey Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, was charged with killing an Oakland police officer after the officer had pulled him over for a traffic violation. Evidence showed Newton had been shot in the abdomen during the incident and may have entered a state of shock/unconsciousness, even though a witness testified that he saw Newton produce a handgun and shoot the officer. Newton asserted the unconsciousness defense. Due to various judicial errors, the case against Newton was eventually dismissed and he was never convicted of murdering the police officer. The significance of the case was that it established unconsciousness, a state of mind where a person cannot control their actions, as a complete criminal defense in California. In the case of Spejcher, she was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. The jury believed she killed without intent, during a lawful act done in a dangerous manner. In this instance, it was smoking marijuana that unpredictably triggered psychosis. The reasoning behind this verdict is that while she didn't have malice for murder, her voluntary decision to use cannabis created the risk that led to a death. To many, there was a problem with the prosecution not charging murder. Many felt the brutality and multiplicity wounds provided enough circumstantial evidence for proof of intent or implied malice. It took Spejcher a lot of time to stab, slash, and cut her victim over 100 times as he attempted to fight off her attack, all allegedly happening while she was unconscious. The multitude of slashes and stabs could allow one to infer that Spejcher appreciated the deadly nature of her actions and that it was not accidental or done on an impulse. One can conclude that this case hinged on the paid testimony of medical experts. Some felt that the prosecution should have done more to challenge the experts' psychosis findings and present more forensic and behavioral evidence demonstrating the implied malice despite any alleged psychosis. In the end, the judge who presided over the case sentenced Spejcher to 2 years probation and 100 hours of community service. The judge concluded that Spejcher had suffered a cannabis-induced psychotic disorder, which the court accepted as causing her to be unconscious during the act of violence. The judge emphasized that although the psychosis was induced by a voluntarily ingested substance, marijuana, the level of impairment reached a degree that she lacked conscious control over her actions at the time, thus she could not be guilty of murder. Even though she never got any jail time, Spejcher is appealing her sentence. She claims her psychosis was triggered in part because her victim allegedly pressured her to smoke from the bong and that she did not know what was in it. Thus, she argues that if intoxication was not truly voluntary, if she reasonably could not foresee the risk, then the prosecution may not have proven she acted with the required criminal negligence. So on the night of May 27, 2018, Chad O'Melia went looking for a high but ended up with a real low, while Bryn Spejcher never spent a day in prison after stabbing him over 100 times.